In the harsh lands of the American frontier, where survival demands more than strength alone, true courage is found not in the absence of fear, but in the choice to stand when everything seems lost. The autumn wind carried dust and whispers through the narrow streets of Dust Valley as Clara Miller stepped down from the rickety stagecoach. Her worn black dress, the same one she had worn to her husband's funeral a year ago, hung loose on her thin frame. The silver medallion at her throat, the only valuable thing she owned, caught the fading sunlight as she clutched her small carpetbag with trembling hands. The mining town sprawled before her like a wound in the earth. Wooden buildings leaned against each other for support, their paint peeling under the relentless desert sun. Men in dusty work clothes and women in faded calico dresses stopped their conversations to stare at the newcomer. Their eyes held no warmth, only suspicion and something darker, a hunger for someone weaker than themselves. "You the Miller woman?" Sheriff Davidson emerged from the shadows of the general store, his badge tarnished and his belly straining against his vest. Behind him lurked his son Jake, a cruel-faced young man whose reputation for troublemaking was known throughout the territory. "I am Clara Miller," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "My husband worked the copper mine before the cave-in." A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. Old women crossed themselves while men spat into the dust. The name Miller had become synonymous with bad luck in Dust Valley. Ever since Thomas Miller had died in the mine collapse, nothing had gone right for the town. The copper vein had run dry, 3 more men had died in accidents, and the winter had been the harshest in memory. "Cursed," someone whispered from the crowd, brought nothing but misery. Clara, his knuckles whitened around her bag, his handle. She had nowhere else to go, no family to take her in, no money for passage to another town. Dust Valley was her last hope, even if its people saw her as their doom incarnate. The months that followed were a descent into humiliation that Clara had never imagined possible. Each dawn brought fresh torment as she wandered the dusty streets of Dust Valley, searching for any work that might keep her alive another day. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, slammed the door in her face when Clara offered to sweep floors for bread crusts. "We do not need your kind of luck," the woman hissed through the wooden planks. At the seamstress shop, Clara's skilled fingers were rejected before she could even demonstrate her needlework. The blacksmith would not let her carry water for his forge, claiming her presence would curse his horseshoes. By November, Clara had taken to sleeping in the hayloft above Murphy's stable, paying for the privilege with the few coins she earned washing dishes at the saloon during the slowest hours. The saloon girls pitied her but dared not show it openly, fearing they too would become targets of the town's collective spite. The worst humiliations came on Sundays after church services. The townspeople would gather in the square, and somehow Clara always became the center of their entertainment. They would point and whisper loud enough for her to hear, recounting every misfortune that had befallen Dust Valley since her arrival. When young Billy Thompson broke his arm falling from a tree, they blamed Clara's evil eye. When the general store's roof leaked during a rare rainstorm, they said her presence had angered the heavens. Jake Davidson took particular pleasure in her suffering. He would follow her through the streets with his friends, making crude jokes about widows and bad luck. Sometimes he would kick dust at her skirts when she passed, laughing as she hurried away with whatever dignity she could preserve. The silver medallion around her neck grew heavier each day, a reminder of better times when she had been loved and respected. Clara often held it while she cried silent tears in the darkness of the stable, wondering how much longer she could endure this living nightmare. The spring cattle fair brought strangers to Dust Valley, and with them, a temporary reprieve from the daily torment that had become Clara's existence. She moved through the crowded market square like a ghost, invisible to the ranchers and traders who had come to buy and sell livestock. That was when Jake Davidson and his friends cornered her near the water trough. "Look what we have here, boys," Jake sneered, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey despite the early hour. The cursed widow, spreading her bad luck among decent folk. Clara clutched her shawl tighter and tried to step around them, but they blocked her path. The crowd continued their business, deliberately looking away from the unfolding cruelty. "Maybe we should help you leave town permanent-like," Jake continued, grabbing her arm roughly. "Nobody wants you here anyway." "Let go of me," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the noise of the fair. "Or what?" Jake laughed, tightening his grip until she winced. "You will curse me too?" "Bring more bad luck too." The words died in his throat as a shadow fell across them. A tall man in a black coat had appeared beside them, silent as death itself. Thomas Blackwood was a name whispered in saloons from Texas to Colorado. The Iron Wolf, they called him. His weathered face showed no expression, but his gray eyes held the kind of coldness that came from seeing too much death. "The lady asked you to let go," Blackwood said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Jake, his friends melted away like snow in summer, but the sheriff, his son, was too proud and too drunk to back down. "This is not your business, stranger. This here is a local matter." Blackwood, his hand moved to rest on the grip of his Colt .45. "I am making it my business." The market square had gone silent. Even the cattle seemed to sense the tension crackling in the air. Jake finally released Clara's arm, his face flushed with humiliation. "You will regret this," Jake muttered, backing away. Blackwood turned to Clara, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. Might I have a word with you in private?" "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Miller," Thomas Blackwood said as they stood in the shade of the blacksmith's shop, away from the curious stares of the townspeople. His voice was steady, businesslike, as if he were discussing the price of cattle rather than a woman's future. Clara studied his weathered face, searching for signs of the cruelty she had grown accustomed to seeing in men his eyes. Instead, she found only a distant respect and something that might have been loneliness. "I own a ranch 30 miles north of here," he continued, removing his hat and turning it slowly in his hands. "It is good land, with water and grass, but it is a lonely place for a man alone. I need a wife to help manage the household, and you need protection from the wolves that circle you here." The directness of his offer stunned Clara into silence. After months of being treated like a plague carrier, here was a man speaking to her as if she were a human being worthy of consideration. "Why?" she finally managed to ask. "You do not know me. I could be everything they say I am." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I have seen real evil, and it does not wear the face of a grieving widow trying to survive with dignity." Within the hour, they stood before the traveling preacher who had come with the cattle fair. The ceremony was brief and witnessed only by the preacher, his wife, and 2 confused ranchers who happened to be passing by. Clara spoke her vows in a voice barely above a whisper, while Thomas's words carried the weight of a solemn contract. The journey to Blackwood Ranch took them through rolling hills covered in spring grass and wildflowers. Clara sat beside her new husband on the wagon seat, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. He pointed out landmarks along the way: Eagle Rock, where Comanche warriors once made their stand, and Silver Creek, which ran clear and cold year-round. The ranch house sat in a valley protected by low hills, its log walls solid and welcoming. Thomas helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy, then showed her to the room that would be hers alone. "This was my sister, this room," he explained, setting her carpet bag on the simple wooden dresser. "She lived here until she married and moved to California. You will find everything you need, and if you do not, just ask." Spring melted into summer as Clara learned the rhythms of ranch life. Each morning brought new lessons as Thomas patiently taught her the skills she would need to survive in this harsh but beautiful land. She learned to read the sky for signs of weather, to spot a lame horse from 100 yards away, and to calculate how much hay would be needed to feed the cattle through winter. Her hands, once soft from town living, grew calloused from milking cows and tending the vegetable garden that would provide their sustenance through the cold months ahead. Thomas proved to be a patient teacher and a respectful companion. He never raised his voice, never showed impatience when she struggled with unfamiliar tasks, and never once crossed the invisible boundary that separated their sleeping quarters. Their conversations were practical, discussions of ranch business, weather patterns, and the health of their livestock, but Clara began to sense depths beneath his quiet exterior. It was in the small details that she glimpsed his mysterious past. The way his hand instinctively moved to his gun when strangers approached. The collection of books in his study. Volumes of poetry and philosophy that seemed at odds with his reputation as the Iron Wolf. The careful way he maintained 3 different rifles, each one perfectly cleaned and oiled. Most intriguing was the daguerreotype photograph he kept face down on his desk. Clara had glimpsed it once while dusting, a young woman holding a small child, both smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that seemed to belong to another lifetime. She never asked about it, understanding instinctively that some wounds were too deep for casual conversation. By autumn, their partnership had settled into comfortable efficiency. Clara managed the household accounts, preserved vegetables for winter, and traded eggs and butter with neighboring ranches for supplies they could not produce themselves. Thomas handled the cattle, maintained the buildings, and dealt with the occasional problems that arose when men lived far from the civilizing influence of towns and churches. The loneliness that had driven both of them to this arrangement began to fade, replaced by something neither quite dared to name. It was not love, not yet, but it was respect, companionship, and the beginning of trust between two people who had learned to be wary of the world and its promises. The first snow of winter was falling when the stranger arrived at Blackwood Ranch. Clara was hanging laundry in the kitchen when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the frosted window, she watched Thomas emerge from the barn, his posture instantly alert and dangerous. The rider was a thin man in a dusty black coat, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He did not dismount, instead calling out from the saddle in a voice that carried across the yard like the whisper of a rattlesnake. "Hello, Iron Wolf. Been a long time." Clara could not hear Thomas's reply, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand moved unconsciously toward his weapon. The conversation lasted only minutes before the stranger wheeled his horse around and disappeared into the swirling snow. That evening, Thomas sat by the fire cleaning his guns with unusual intensity. Clara worked on her mending, stealing glances at her husband's troubled face. "Old debts have a way of finding a man," he said finally, not looking up from the rifle across his knees. "No matter how far he runs or how much he changes. Is there danger coming to us?" Clara asked quietly. Thomas was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the crackling of logs and the wind rattling the windows. "Maybe. I want you to know where I keep the extra ammunition, and which horse is fastest if you need to ride for help." The winter grew harder after that visit. Thomas became more watchful, checking the perimeter of their land each morning and evening. He taught Clara to shoot his spare revolver, insisting she practice until she could hit a tin can at 20 paces. When young Pastor William rode out from town in February with news and supplies, he brought troubling gossip from Dust Valley. Sheriff Davidson had been asking questions about Thomas Blackwood, wanting to know about his past and his business. Jake Davidson had been heard bragging that the Iron Wolf's days were numbered. "They are saying you were mixed up with outlaws down in Texas," Pastor William said hesitantly, his youthful face flushed with embarrassment at having to repeat such rumors. Thomas nodded grimly. "A man does what he must to survive. Sometimes the choices are not between good and evil, but between bad and worse." After the pastor left, Thomas began making preparations. He rode into town the next morning, his face set with grim determination. Clara watched him go from the porch, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their peaceful interlude was ending. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a menace that Clara had hoped would never materialize. Will Harper rode into their valley like a plague of locusts, accompanied by 3 hard-faced men whose eyes held the cold calculation of professional killers. Clara first spotted them from the kitchen window as she prepared the noon meal. 4 riders sat motionless on the ridge overlooking their ranch, silhouetted against the pale sky like harbingers of doom. She called to Thomas, who was repairing fence posts near the barn. He took one look at the distant figures and his face went ashen. "Get inside and bar the door," he ordered, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Whatever happens, do not come out until I tell you it is safe." But Harper and his men did not attack immediately. Instead, they made camp on the ridge, their cook fire visible each night like a malevolent star. For 3 days they waited, a constant reminder of the violence that hung over the ranch like storm clouds. On the 4th morning, Harper rode down alone, his hands conspicuously empty of weapons but his smile sharp as a blade. Clara watched from behind the curtained window as he dismounted and approached the porch where Thomas waited. "Hello, Iron Wolf," Harper drawled, his voice carrying the lazy menace of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain. "You have done well for yourself. Nice spread, good water, and a pretty wife to boot." "State your business, Harper." "Then ride out," Thomas replied, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Business?" Harper laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Why, I am here to collect what you owe me, partner. Remember that bank job in Abilene? You rode off with my share of the gold, left me to face the law alone. Spent 5 years in prison because of you. You got greedy and tried to kill that bank clerk. I stopped you, and you know it." "Details," Harper waved dismissively. "Point is, you owe me, and I am here to collect that gold you stole, plus interest. And if you cannot pay in coin, His eyes turned toward the house where Clara stood hidden. "Well, I reckon that pretty wife of yours might cover the debt nicely." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Clara felt ice form in her veins as she realized the true nature of the danger they faced. This was not just about Thomas, his past. It was about her future, her freedom, her very life. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, swift and merciless as a prairie fire. Clara woke to the sound of gunshots and Thomas shouting her name. Through the bedroom window, she saw muzzle flashes from the barn and the corral, where Harper's men had taken position in the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas burst through her door, blood streaming from a graze across his forehead. "They have us surrounded," he gasped, pressing his spare revolver into her hands. "Harper wants to flush us out, take us alive." For hours they held their ground, returning fire from the reinforced windows. Thomas had prepared for this moment. But as the sun climbed higher, Clara realized they were trapped. Harper had positioned his men with the patience of a hunter who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "I will not let him take you," Thomas said during a lull in the shooting, his gray eyes fierce with determination. "I would rather die first. Then we die together," Clara replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. But when Thomas collapsed from blood loss near midday, struck by a bullet that shattered his shoulder, Clara knew their fortress had become their tomb. Harper's voice carried across the yard, taunting them to surrender, promising mercy they both knew he would never show. As darkness fell, Clara made her choice. While Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, she slipped out through the root cellar, using the tunnel Thomas had dug as an escape route. Her destination was Devil's Canyon, 5 miles north, where she had seen smoke from Harper's camp. The night was moonless, perfect for what she intended. Clara moved through the scrub brush like a ghost, her dark clothing blending with the shadows. She had learned much about survival in her year on the ranch, lessons that now served her in ways Thomas never could have imagined. Harper's camp was carelessly guarded, the men confident in their victory. Clara crept close enough to hear their crude jokes about what they would do with their prisoners. The rage that filled her was colder than winter wind, sharper than broken glass. She struck like lightning, using fire as her weapon. The dried grass around their camp caught quickly, spreading faster than the panicked outlaws could react. In the chaos of flame and smoke, Clara's revolver spoke 6 times, each shot carefully aimed and deadly accurate. When dawn broke over Devil's Canyon, only ashes and silence remained. Clara returned from Devil's Canyon as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky gold and crimson. Her dress was torn and smoke-stained, her hands blackened with soot and gunpowder, but her eyes held a fierce light that spoke of battles won and demons conquered. Thomas was awake when she entered the house, propped against pillows with his wounded shoulder bound in clean bandages. He took one look at her face and asked no questions, understanding immediately that the threat which had hung over them like a storm cloud had been permanently lifted. "It is finished," Clara said simply, setting his revolver on the table beside the bed. "Harper and his men will trouble no one ever again." The weeks that followed brought healing in more ways than one. As Thomas's shoulder mended, so did the invisible barriers that had kept them at careful distance from each other. The shared danger had forged something stronger than their marriage of convenience. It had created a bond tempered in fire and sealed with trust earned through blood. Summer brought unexpected visitors to Blackwood Ranch. Young Sarah Whitman arrived one sultry July afternoon, her eyes hollow with the same desperation Clara remembered from her own dark days in Dust Valley. The girl was barely 16, orphaned when fever claimed her parents, and facing the kind of predatory attention that drove women to desperate choices. "Please," Sarah whispered, standing on their porch like a wounded bird. "I heard you might take in someone willing to work. I can cook and sew and tend animals. I will not be any trouble." Clara saw her own past reflected in the girl's frightened face and opened their door without hesitation. Thomas agreed immediately, understanding that their home had become a sanctuary for those whom the world had cast aside. Under Clara's patient guidance, Sarah blossomed from a frightened waif into a capable young woman. She learned to manage the chickens and milk the cows, to preserve vegetables for winter and track the household accounts. More importantly, she learned that strength could be found in the most unexpected places, and that survival was not just about enduring hardship but about building something meaningful from the ashes of what came before. By autumn, the 3 of them had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Thomas handled the heavy ranch work while Clara managed the business side of their operation, her sharp mind for figures making their modest spread increasingly profitable.